In this video, Gayle King is interviewing the police union president, what's his name, Ryan Nichols, about a possible cover-up or claims of a cover-up in the Breonna Taylor case. I want to watch this video and see if I detect any signs of deception. All of the opinions expressed in this video are just that, opinions. I reserve the right to be wrong. I'm not formally accusing anyone of anything in this video, but I will tell you what I see and give you my interpretation. I've skipped the first minute or so of the video because that's just the beginning of this news segment and I want to get right into the interview. So we're going to watch the interview and I'll point out any suspicious activity that I see.
You know, there are two sides, of course, to every story. But what is not in dispute is that Breonna Taylor is dead, that she was killed in a hail of police gunfire. But let's go to Kenneth Walker and his encounter with police. 32 shots fired that night after he fired what he said was one warning shot, not knowing what was happening in his apartment.
So I do believe that the officers were definitely justified in returning fire.
32 shots, Ryan?
Something that's interesting there is that he's saying that he believes the officers were justified in returning fire, but he's kind of overdoing it a little bit. Let's see what he says again.
So I do believe that the officers were definitely justified in returning fire.
He says, I do believe that the officers were definitely justified. It seems a little bit like convincing rather than conveying. He could have just said, I believe the officers were justified in returning fire. I think he does believe that, but I don't know if he believes they were justified in returning over 30 shots in response to one shot. That's why I feel like there might be a little bit of a deception there with his convincing rather than conveying.
Shot, not knowing what was happening in his apartment.
So I do believe that the officers were definitely justified in returning fire.
32 shots, Ryan? 32 shots?
Well, in a situation like that, when you return fire to stop a threat, typically you may not be aware of how many rounds someone else is firing.
Let's back that up just a little. He's got his eyebrows raised a lot. If you are talking and you raise your eyebrows, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's just a conversational signal. It may be adding emphasis to something you're saying. But when you have them up for a really long time throughout most of your explanation, a lot of experts call that the believe me look. Like you may not, it's a sign that you may not have complete confidence in what you're saying, but you want the other person to think that you do. You want the other person to believe you. So I think he may have his eyebrows raised a little longer than I would be comfortable with in this explanation about I was about to say the fact about him saying that the officers were justified in what they did. I think he may partially believe that. Breonna Taylor's boyfriend fired a shot, they returned fire. That's justified, but I don't think he believes that they were justified in how much fire they returned.
How many?
So let's see those eyebrows again.
32 shots, Ryan? 32 shots?
Well, in a situation like that, when you return fire to stop a threat, typically
so the eyebrows went up and then they came back down, but then they went up again immediately and they stay up for quite a while.
Someone else is firing, how many other officers are firing.
So I think he's trying to justify something he doesn't feel like was necessarily justified.
An accurate count of the rounds you fired in a high stress situation like that.
How do you explain the incident report from the night that said that there was no forced entry in the apartment? We know that's not true. They said that there were no shots that were fired when Breonna Taylor was hit at least 5 times.
Obviously, the information had not been completely filled out in the portion of the incident report that was released, not by any means suggesting that the police were saying none of those things occurred, because it was obvious they had. Not being part of that investigation, I think probably the report should not have been released at that time.
You have...
He's being pretty much truthful there because he's basically admitting that the report had some missing facts and they jumped the gun and they shouldn't have done that. So he's basically admitting something there. So that part's truthful.
The attorneys for Kenneth Walker claiming cover-up. You have the grand jurors who talked to us.
Wow, that's interesting. When Gayle King says cover-up, he has an extended blink and then a fluttering of the eyelashes.
You have the attorneys for Kenneth Walker claiming cover-up. You have the grand jurors.
So that an extended blink or the eyes fluttering like that is like a blocking, like putting up a barrier. So he obviously doesn't like the fact that people are claiming there's a cover-up.
Who talked to us a couple of days ago.
They covered it up. That's what the evidence that I saw. And I felt like there should have been lots more charges.
I want to get your response to their belief that there was and is a cover-up by the Louisville Police Department about what happened that night.
I don't believe there's a cover-up of anything that occurred.
There's several interesting things that happen in here. Let's watch it again and I'll pause it and point them out one by one so I don't miss anything. So let's just go back a little.
And about what happened that night.
So immediately he starts to get tension in the lips. As soon as Gayle King mentions that people think there's a cover-up.
That there was and is a cover-up by the Louisville Police Department about what happened that night.
Tension in the lips.
I don't believe that.
Shifting his anchor points. Your anchor points are the parts of your body that connect you to the earth. If you're standing up, it's your feet. If you're sitting in a chair, it's your butt, your back, your elbows. When someone asks you a question and you start shifting your anchor points, that's a sign that you're uncomfortable, and it's a possible sign of deception. It's a red flag. And so he starts with tension in the lips, then starts shifting his anchor points.
Department about what happened that night.
I don't believe there's a cover.
And there is even a little bit of a shrug there.
Up of anything.
And then a little bit of a stutter too. If he's talking smoothly most of the time and then he starts stuttering or repeating words or, have that broken speech pattern, kind of like I do now, that's also a sign of possible deception. So when you see three things like that, it's a cluster. So he's got the tension in the lips, and he's got the shifting of the anchor points, and then he's not speaking as smoothly as before. If he's denying that there's any kind of cover-up, I don't know if he necessarily believes what he's saying.
And about what happened that night.
I don't believe there's a cover-up of anything that occurred. Can I definitely say affirmatively that no mistakes on anything were made? Obviously not, but I
That part's true.
don't believe that there was any type of cover-up, and if there was, that would definitely be found out by the many entities that are conducting these investigations.
Are you comfortable, Ryan, with the grand jury's findings in the case?
I have faith that the Attorney General did a thorough.
That was really interesting too. I have faith. Closes his eyes, tilts his head, shrugs his shoulders. Does that look like someone who has faith in anything? I have faith. Let's watch that again.
Are you comfortable, Ryan, with the grand jury's findings in the case?
I have faith that the Attorney General.
I have faith. It doesn't look like it.
Ryan, with the grand jury's findings in the case?
I have faith that the Attorney General did a thorough and complete investigation and has a competent, qualified staff to do that.
You're calling Attorney General Cameron's investigation a complete and thorough investigation. Other people would disagree with you about that. That's why the more you hear about this case, the more...
When Gayle says that other people would disagree with him about that, he closes his eyes and leans back. So closing the eyes, again, is putting up a barrier. Leaning back is avoidance. So he didn't like that very much.
A complete and thorough investigation. Other people would disagree with you about that. That's why the more you hear about this case, the more questions are being raised. Do you see that?
Yes, ma'am, I understand that. There's other agencies and entities that are still looking into things from other aspects of the investigation. If they conclude that it was a tragic incident, but nothing illegal happened, then we have to be willing to deal with that and move forward from that also.
You don't believe race has played a role here at all?
No, I don't think this occurred as a result of any type of racial issue, or that this was determined by race somehow.
Do you think outside of this case that the Louisville Police Department has a problem with racial bias?
No, I think
That just looks really interesting there. She's asking him a question. He reacts before she even finishes asking the question.
The police department has a problem with...
And the tensing of the lips and pulling his head back is like, he didn't like that question.
with racial bias?
Licking the lips is a possible sign of deception. That alone doesn't mean anything. You're always looking for clusters. If you see something that could be an indicator of deception, you're usually looking to see two or more to make a cluster.
Out of this case that the Louisville Police Department has a problem with racial bias?
no, I think we're
He's got the licking of the lips, and then again the eyes close.
Problem with racial bias?
No, I think we're a very diverse department. We try to stay up with the national best practices.
In 2020,
They try to stay up with the national best practices. Do they stay up with the practices? Do they have race issues in their department? I don't know.
in 2020, 45% of the arrests have been black people, but they only make up 23% of the Louisville population. And you go from that to the tragedies that occur. How?
I've got to respond to this question because I think that the media is making a huge issue out of race. I think that, of course, there are going to be racists. There have been throughout history, and there probably always will be. But let me look at these stats again. I made a note. She says that 45% of arrests are black people, but they only make up 23% of the population, and the inference is therefore racism. But you can't just look at the populations down here, the number of arrests are up here. It's disproportionate, so it must be racism. Well, if one particular group commits more crimes, if they commit a disproportionate number of crimes, then they're going to be arrested in a disproportionate number compared to their population. So there are other facts and statistics that we would have to look at. Could it be a problem with racism? Sure. But just saying that there are 45% of arrests are black people, and black people are only, 23% of the population, you can't say arrests here, population here, therefore racism. There are other circumstances, and I don't like the fact that the media keeps pushing that narrative. They want to, anytime anything looks like it could possibly be racist, they love to slap the label on it and call it racist. And I think that the media is responsible for a lot of the tensions that we have in our country right now. So forgive me for injecting my personal opinion into the story here, but let's go ahead and see how he answers it.
How do you explain that?
Well, so I don't have all the specific numbers of if you're talking shooting tragedies or anything like that.
Again, extended blinks and excessive fluttering of the eyes there. He doesn't really want to answer this question, and so he does it by issuing a non-answer. I don't have the stats and this and that.
Well, we can agree that there is a difference in the number when it comes to black victims and white victims at the hand of the police. Can we at least agree on that?
Sure. So
he agrees to it reluctantly. I had to kind of think about it for a second.
the circumstances that lead up to every specific incident, whether it's an officer-involved shooting here or anywhere else, an investigation occurs.
How do you explain how many police officers do not seem to be held accountable in these type of incidents?
Well, I would say that once those investigations occur, the police are and definitely should be held accountable.
Okay, there's a few possible signs of deception there too. She's asking why aren't the police held accountable when stuff like this happens? And he licks his lips. He shifts his anchor points again.
In these type of incidents?
Well, I would say that once
Possible one shoulder shrug there. Let's look at that again.
Accountable in these type of incidents?
Well, I would say that once those
Actually, it looked like both shoulders shrugged. So starts with the licking of the lips and then shifts his anchor points. Those are both red flags, possible signs of deception. It's important to note that there's no one aha. You can't see someone shift their anchor points or lick their lips and then go, boom, you're a liar. There are certain things that are red flags, which is an indication of possible deception. The more red flags you see, the more likely it is that they're not being truthful.
Well, I would say that once those investigations occur, the police are and definitely should be held accountable.
But they're not, though, Ryan Nichols. They're not held accountable.
Well, ma'am, if the law here is such that nothing illegal occurred on either side of that door that night, and our Attorney General did find some charges to pursue and is going to pursue those charges as it relates to one officer, how is the accountability not occurring?
There's a lot of kind of reframing the question there so he can answer that accountability is occurring, but that's because he kind of changed the rules. He restructured the question so he could answer it that way without outright lying.
What's the morale of your police department these days?
So morale is low here. They want to be here, and they don't want citizens to have to live in fear of violence of any kind.
Right.
And so it's very frustrating.
It is frustrating. An attorney for Sergeant John.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure it is frustrating, but I guess it's up to you now. Tell me in the comments what you think. Is he completely full of it? Is he telling the truth? My opinion is that it's somewhere in between. On some of the questions, he was being truthful. On some, I believe he's being deceptive. And then on some, it's kind of sort of in the middle. He wants to reframe the question so he can answer a certain way without lying, which is also deceptive. So I suspect that he's being deceptive on his answers to certain questions. But we won't know until all of the investigations are complete, because the only way to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone is in fact lying is if you have evidence that contradicts what they say. But in my opinion, he's being deceptive on a few different points there. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. If you like this video, like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And I'll see you next time.